Liam and I weren't close, just casual acquaintances, not even buddies. Our paths crossed purely by chance. I lent him a hand once. Yeah, it happens. His car broke down on the outskirts of town, and as fate would have it, his phone battery died. He was frantically waving for help, but no one, not a single soul, pulled over. Except me. I stopped. We hooked up his car with a makeshift tow, and I hauled it all the way to his place. After that, Liam took my number and vowed to repay me, sincerely and wholeheartedly, as he put it. He wasn't all talk either. He kept his word. A week later, he gave me a ring and invited me to a cozy little restaurant. Turns out, the place was his. We had a great time, sipping on some fine cognac, enjoying delicious dishes. We chatted about life for hours, and when he found out I owned a couple of auto repair shops, Liam mentioned he'd start bringing his car to me and even recommend my services to his friends. And so, that's how it all began. We met up occasionally after that, and he'd swing by now and then for a checkup or some maintenance. One day, Liam gave me a call and asked me to join him for his birthday bash. Naturally, the celebration was happening at his restaurant. I figured, why not? My wife was off on a week-long business trip anyway. These trips had never been a thing for her before, but about 2 years ago, she got promoted. Since then, she's had to travel quite a bit. The most frustrating part was that we could never plan anything. They'd spring these trips on her out of nowhere. One moment everything's normal, and by lunchtime, she'd be on the phone telling me she's leaving either that night or the next morning. But there was an upside to these trips. When she got back, our intimacy and connection seemed to spark up again. We always had a tender, loving relationship, but after she returned, there was this renewed excitement. We'd hold hands more, whisper sweet nothings, and of course, indulge in all sorts of affectionate nonsense. The downside, though, was that these trips were either getting more frequent or longer. She used to be gone once every couple of months, but now it could be twice a month or for a full 2 weeks at a stretch. Anyway, back to the story. On the day of Liam's party, he mentioned he wanted to introduce me to his woman. He said she was the most stunning person he'd ever laid eyes on. The catch: she's married. Her husband, as Liam put it, is a complete loser. They haven't been intimate in ages. The guy's a drunk, and even had the nerve to raise his hand against her once. What a scumbag. And since they don't have kids, because the man's terminally ill, she can't bring herself to leave him. Says she feels too sorry for him. But Liam's determined to push things forward, especially since they're in love. Plus, his Camilla promised to give him a son. I even joked about the coincidence. My wife's name is Camila too. Camilla showed up about 40 minutes after the party had kicked off. The moment she walked in, my heart plummeted to my stomach. Literally. Liam's beloved, the woman he'd been raving about, turned out to be my wife. She looked stunning in a gorgeous yellow dress, her favorite color, no less. It fit her figure perfectly. The understated makeup, the stilettos. She was breathtaking, no doubt about it. It seemed this was the first time she decided to step out with her lover because Liam eagerly introduced her to his closest friends and business colleagues. I slipped away to the bathroom, unnoticed. Inside, bitterness and betrayal burned like acid, especially after hearing what she had apparently said about me to her lover. We have 2 kids, a boy and a girl. I just couldn't wrap my head around it. For about an hour, I managed to avoid crossing paths with the birthday boy and his lady. Instead, I watched my wife enjoying herself, accepting compliments from other men, and flirting with Liam. Then I finally stood up, raised my glass, and made a toast, something along the lines of, "To the host and hostess of this fine celebration." I saw my wife blush at first, then her face turned deathly pale. She bolted from the table and fled the restaurant as fast as her heels would carry her. Liam ran after her. What happened after that? I have no idea. I just exited through the kitchen and the back rooms, Not sure why I felt the need to sneak out like that, but I did. Once I got home, I pulled out a bottle of Finnish vodka, sat down in the kitchen, and waited. My wife came back 2 hours later. Her makeup was gone, and she was dressed in her business trip attire. We couldn't have a conversation that night, or even the next. My wife clung to me like a shadow, crying and endlessly repeating, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." It became unbearable. I couldn't stand to see her or hear that constant refrain of "I'm sorry." So I moved out. She kept calling nonstop. First, I had to turn off my phone. And eventually, I changed my number altogether. I filed for divorce, passing the news to her through my mother-in-law. She broke down in court, refusing to go through with it, but I divided everything fairly. The business, the apartment, all the assets. Naturally, our considerate court granted custody of the kids to her. She doesn't stop me from seeing them. But why did she do it? Honestly, I don't know, and I've stopped trying to figure it out. It's been over a year now, and my wife, ex-wife, as I'm still not used to saying, continues to try to talk to me as if nothing's changed. Whenever any mutual acquaintance brings her up, I politely ask them to change the subject. The only thing from our past that still matters to me is the kids. A year passed since the divorce, and life started to find its rhythm again. I opened a new shop in a different part of the city, far from where my ex-wife and I used to live. There was plenty of work, which was a blessing. Staying busy kept my mind off the past. I didn't see or hear from Liam anymore, and honestly, I wasn't looking to. They say time heals all wounds, but sometimes it drags its feet. Evenings were still the hardest. The loneliness, the quiet, it all weighed heavily on me, making it impossible not to think about how things used to be. I didn't see the kids as often as I would have liked, though they were the one thing that brightened my days. Every time we met, I made sure to give them all the attention I could, so they'd never feel neglected. One evening, as I was wrapping up work in the shop, I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, there stood my ex-wife, Camilla, her head bowed, clutching an envelope in her hands. I didn't want to let her in, but there was a deep sorrow in her eyes that made it impossible for me to simply shut the door in her face. "Can you listen to me, just for a moment?" she asked quietly. Without a word, I stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She walked in and took a seat on an old chair by the workbench. We sat there in silence for a bit. Slowly, Camilla pulled the envelope from her hand and placed it on the table in front of me. "What's this?" I asked, hesitant to touch it. "It's a letter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I've been trying to find the right way to say all of this, but I couldn't find the words. "Please, read it after I'm gone." She stood up and moved toward the door. Pausing at the threshold, she whispered, "I never stopped loving you." Those words cut through me, but I simply nodded. Her words felt hollow, like an echo from the past. Too much time had passed, and the wounds were still too raw. After the door closed behind her, I sat there, staring at the envelope for what felt like ages. Finally, I picked it up and slowly tore it open. Inside were several handwritten pages. The letter began with an apology. She confessed her weakness, explaining how lost she had felt, how Liam had manipulated her emotions, filling her head with promises of a better life, things she had never even truly desired. She wrote about how her life had spiraled into a nightmare after our divorce. Liam turned out to be nothing like the man she'd imagined at the start. He began drinking, causing scenes, and eventually abandoned her altogether when he found out she could no longer have children. But the most crushing blow for her was losing me and the kids. The realization that she had single-handedly destroyed her own happiness made her life unbearable. The letter was soaked in regret and sorrow, the anguish of someone who had torn apart their own world with their own hands. When I finished reading, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. A whirlwind of emotions churned inside me. Anger, pity, but mostly a deep sense of emptiness. The letter didn't change anything for me. It didn't revive the feelings I once had for her. All of that was in the past, and that's where it belonged. I stood up, slipped the letter back into the envelope, and without a second thought, tossed it in the trash. The past couldn't be rewritten, but I had the power to decide how to move forward. From that moment on, I resolved to start my life anew, without regrets, without pain, and without the lingering shadows of the past.